Well, hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Tuesday, April 19th. And tonight, we're talking about the evolving war in Ukraine. Russia says it's begun a new phase of its invasion. The Pentagon says we're already seeing the effects of that. We'll get some perspective from a former NATO commander. Retired Admiral James Stavridis joins us next. This brutal conflict is challenging some assumptions about modern warfare. But one constant has been the trains evacuating millions of people. What's it like working on those trains, risking your life to bring others to safety? We'll take a closer look. Plus, masks on public transportation are mostly optional now after a judge's ruling. The Biden administration is considering an appeal, but in the meantime, what does that mean for your next flight? You'll hear from the head of the nation's flight attendants union. And the major leagues are looking more diverse these days. Meet the women breaking new ground in baseball. Today, Russia made it clear it is refocusing its attacks on the east. The Ukrainian government is reaching out to the west for help again. Vladimir Putin's forces have already been pushed back from around Kyiv. Now they're starting a new phase of this war in the Donbas region. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the goal is, quote, full liberation of the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. That term republics implies that they're independent territories, not part of Ukraine. Now, Russian-backed separatists control parts of those areas, and clearly Mr. Putin wants the rest now. Meanwhile, Ukraine's resistance fighters in the southern part of the country are continuing to hold on to Mariupol. That is despite Russia's demands that they surrender. Russian artillery has leveled much of the city. Thousands are feared dead. Russian forces also continue to shell a steel plant there. Hundreds of civilians are seeking shelter inside. Ukrainian officials say Russia is using heavy bunker bombs on the plant. President Volodymyr Zelensky says the situation in Mariupol, in his words, remains tough and asked for more military aid. Well, that aid might come soon. We expect the White House to announce another military package to Ukraine this week. And the Ukrainians are making some diplomatic strides. Today, President Zelensky spoke with the head of the European Commission. Afterward, its president, Ursula von der Leyen, tweeted, quote, Ukraine belongs in our European family, unquote. NBC's Ali Arouzi joins us from Lviv to start us off. And Ali, tell us more about these changing Russian tactics and what all this means. It seems like we've been talking about the potential for this to happen for a while. Now that it's happening, what's the impact?
Well, look, they're focused. They've been saying it for a while after the failed attempt to get Kyiv and its suburbs, that they were going to focus on the Donetsk area, and that is well underway right now. They are attacking that area relentlessly. But as any Ukrainian you speak to, they'll say that war hasn't started here in 2022. That started in 2014. That's an area that the Russians have wanted for a very long time now. They want to connect the mainland to Crimea, to give them a land bridge to the Donetsk area. They keep talking about Russian speakers being there that want to be liberated. And Joshua, at one point, maybe even around 2014 and after it, they did have a level of support there from the residents of that place that spoke Russian. But now you speak to anybody here in Ukraine and you'll see that there is no more sympathy for the Russians in that area, because the Russian speakers in that area have also been shelled relentlessly by the Russians. They don't care that there are people that were once upon a time sympathizers to them. They just want to get that land at all costs. So there's a huge offensive there. They have a military line of attacks that's stretching about 300 miles from the south of that region all the way up to the north to Kharkiv, which has also seen relentless shelling. But the Ukrainians have also sent some of their best fighters to fend them off in that area.
Talk about what this would mean more for some southern and western cities that have been hit by rocket attacks. I understand you spoke to one of the regional military administrators who shed some light on that.
That's right. We spoke to the governor of the Luhansk area, which is, one of the very hard-hit areas. He talked to us today about that area being pounded day and night. All they hear is the sound of missiles and artillery shells morning, noon, and night. They haven't seen any Russian fighters there. He says if we see the Russian fighters, we'll shoot them. But he was also saying, 85% of that area is in Russian control, but they are determined to take it back. They say the geography works in their favor. Let's take a little listen to what he had to tell me earlier. What is Luhansk and all the city, towns and villages around you looking like? Do you hear artillery shells every day? Are the Russians within sight?
Visually, Russians can't be seen, of course, because when we see Russians, we kill them because they're invaders. But talking about the shelling, there are no settlements in Luhansk region which weren't shelled, and where you can't hear the shelling, which is underway in all the cities.
And he also talked about, Chechnyan fighters that are fighting in that area. He's talking about, the brutality they've shown in other places. And he's hearing reports that in some of those cities occupied by the Russians, where the Chechnyans are fighting, that the same sort of atrocities that are being committed in Bucha and Hostomel and Irpin are also happening in those cities that the Russians are in right now.
Also, Ali, tell us a little bit more about what's going on where you are in Lviv. We've been talking about the shifting situation there, including after there was a Russian missile strike not too long ago.
Well, the missile strike happened yesterday morning, and as you and I spoke about it yesterday, it was a very serious strike in the city. 7 people were killed, the first time anybody has been killed in Lviv, and that was bang in the center of the city. Now, it's been quiet today. Unusually, there have been no air raid sirens so far, but that doesn't give anybody here a sense of security anymore. They realize that the Russians have broadened the scope of their attacks, and this is also a target, and not least of all, Joshua, because a lot of the supplies from the West come in through this area. The Ukrainians are hemmed off in the north, the east, and the south. So the only way that they're going to get supplies in, and the only place they can store them before moving it on, is from western parts of the country. And people are fully aware of that. So they know that this place will more than likely be a target again. So nobody is relaxing here anymore, as they may have done maybe a month ago.
Thank you, Ali. Much appreciated. That's NBC's Ali Arouzi starting us off tonight from Lviv in Ukraine. Now, Russia's latest invasion of eastern Ukraine could reshape this war, particularly in the Donbas region. A senior U.S. defense official says Russia is already sending more battalions there. Donbas has been disputed since 2014. That's when Russia took over Crimea. 2 breakaway regions are there. You see them on the right side of the map, Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukraine has fought Russian-backed separatists over that land for the last 8 years. Both Ukrainian and Pentagon officials say they expect Russia to attack much more methodically this time around. What is it about this area that leads them to say that? And if they're right, how might Ukraine respond? Let's continue now with NBC News Chief International Security Analyst James Stavridis. He is a retired 4-star admiral in the United States Navy, and he served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Admiral, welcome. Good to see you again.
Good seeing you, Joshua.
What do you make of the strategy in eastern Ukraine on Russia's part, particularly whether or not it might look qualitatively different than what we saw before in 2014?
It's a move born of failure. In other words, Vladimir Putin initially thought he would be able to sweep across the country, decapitate the regime in Kyiv, kill Zelensky, and put in a puppet regime. That failed. It failed utterly. So instead of conquering this enormous country of Ukraine, he's now forced, essentially, Joshua, to settle, if you will, for this strip of it, maybe 10%, 15%. Here's the bad news. The bad news is that he will be able to concentrate his forces in this relatively small area and move very aggressively because the terrain has changed. He will now be striking across a flat, broad area of Ukraine. He can bring those tanks you're showing, those armored personnel carriers. It gives him more of an advantage to fight in this broad, flat terrain. So look for a difficult battle ahead Having said all that, Joshua, I would not bet against the Ukrainians. They're receiving enormous assistance from the administration, from our NATO allies. They have fighting spirit on their side. I would not count them out.
I wonder how you factor all of that in, what's happening in eastern Ukraine. And could we put that map of Ukraine back up 1 second? Because I'd like to ask how you factor all of those things in of what's happening with eastern Ukraine, alongside what we saw in the last few days, last week, with the sinking of the Moskva, that big Russian warship in the Black Sea, and also the fighting in Mariupol. You see down on the bottom of the map, for those of you looking at the map, Mariupol sits in this body of water called the Sea of Azov. The big body of water below that is the Black Sea, and that's where the Moskva sank. So you've got Luhansk and Donetsk in the east, Mariupol south of that, the Sea of Azov south of that, the Black Sea south of that. How do all those things, Admiral, those various parts of this eastern and southern front lock together in terms of where this war goes now?
Yeah, this is a very astute question, and please leave the map up for just one moment. What Putin wants is to control that strip of land from Donbass, where it shows on the map, down to Crimea, that dongle of land that he currently owns. That would give him, in effect, a land bridge that goes from Russia all the way down to Crimea. Mariupol, unfortunately for its citizens, is the centerpiece of this. He will destroy that city so he can control that entire strip. In terms of that Black Sea, Joshua, he wants it desperately because it's full of hydrocarbons, oil, gas. He's got his Black Sea fleet out there. They got a bloody nose in the sinking of the Moskva, a real disaster for the Russian Navy, but they still have control of those seas. So look for Putin to concentrate forces, both land, sea, and air, in the southeast of the country and try and carve out a chunk of Ukraine that he can hold permanently. That's his objective.
We got some good questions from our viewers, and I'd like to get to those before I have to let you go. We do have a NATO question in a moment, but first let me start with Deb. Deb wrote, I'm trying to figure out 3 things about the war in Ukraine. We'll see if we can go through them real fast. 1, why should Ukraine have to be involved in peace talks? Russia invaded them and should be forced out. 2, how can Russia have what appears to be an unlimited number of missiles? Is another country, i.e. China, supplying them with some stock? And 3, I'm worried that if Putin gains control of Ukraine, what's going to stop him from invading other countries, possibly starting with Finland? Admiral Stavridis, I think I can amalgamate those 3 questions somewhat in terms of the international relationships that are affecting how Russia and Ukraine are prosecuting this war and what might cause the war to finally someday end.
Well, let me answer the middle question first. It's a very good one. Do Russians have unlimited missiles? No. And eventually they will start running out. But they have a very significant stockpile. Thus far, no one is providing them additional missiles, and I don't think that's likely. So, as I always say, war is hell. That's what General Sherman said in the Civil War. But war is also expensive, and time in that sense is on the side of the Ukrainians. Those missile stocks will be depleted. In terms of the other 2 questions, ultimately this thing is going to go to some kind of a negotiation, and the Ukrainians are going to stand very strong on exactly the first point that Deb makes. They were the victim here. They were invaded. So they will stand very firm that they should not have to give up territory. On that third and final point, NATO, the NATO alliance is standing also very strong. And by the way, both Finland, which Deb mentions, and Sweden, 2 very capable nations on the northern flank of NATO, are both applying for membership. I think they'll be brought in very quickly. Highly unlikely Vladimir Putin would dare to invade a NATO country. That's really the crux of this entire conflict. So when I put it all together, Joshua, NATO is in a strong position. We will back the Ukrainians. Look for tough negotiations. Don't look for a lot of give from the Ukrainians.
Yeah, that seems to be the smart money in it, that Finland and Sweden are going to be admitted soon. And glad you brought that up, because that is exactly what Bonnie asked about. Bonnie asked, could Ukraine be fast-tracked into NATO along with Finland and Sweden. It would make sense that they could join since Putin insists there is no war. Once these countries are members, Russia would have to retreat or NATO would help push them out. I understand the concern about World War III and nuclear weapons, but aren't we simply delaying it while cities and civilians are being lost? Should note, Admiral, before you answer, that Finland borders Russia and shares about 800 miles of continuous border with Russia, way up at the northwest of the country, and Sweden is on the other side of Finland. But, Admiral, what would you say to Bonnie's question?
Bonnie, my heart is with you entirely. A part of me says, yes, just grab Ukraine, bring them into NATO right now, kind of simplifies the problem, if you will. At that point, we rolled NATO troops into Ukraine. We put a NATO no-fly zone overhead. But even in your question, you make the point, Russia, nuclear armed, you're escalating toward a potential global war. I think a smarter course at this point, bring in Sweden and Finland, that strengthens the alliance. Give the Ukrainians the tools they need, the heavy armament, the aircraft, the missiles. We can win this foot race of logistics. That is what will stop the Russians. Winston Churchill, before World War II, said to FDR, our president, give us the tools as the Nazis invaded. Give us the tools. We will finish the job. Let's give the Ukrainians the tools, bring Finland and Sweden in. I think that's the best package as we face Vladimir Putin together.
And briefly, before I have to let you go, with regard to however this war is being fought, you wrote a piece in Time magazine asking whether it's worth rethinking the way that we fight wars on the battlefield, including asking whether it is time to write the obituary for the tank on the battlefield, and arguing that it's time to consider reducing tank inventories. What's your sense of how this war in Ukraine is changing the way that wars are waged for whoever the next NATO Supreme Commander? I believe the White House is going to nominate somebody soon if it hasn't already. But in terms of what the strategies are for the wars of the future?
The next commander who will be nominated is Chris Cavoli, four-star Army general, highly qualified. He'll be a fine Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. It's not just tanks, Joshua. It's surface ships. Look at the Moskva, big, huge cruiser taken out by a couple of missiles that cost a few $100,000. Those tanks, thousands are being destroyed. Low-flying aircraft are at risk from these Stinger missiles. It's time to rethink the battlefield. Having said all that, still a role for those heavy traditional platforms, but you have to employ them in a smart way. This is not what Russia has done. They're paying an enormous price for that on the battlefield. We can still use our tanks, still use our surface ships. We've got to do it in an intelligent way, move them forward with protection, integrate them with other fires. But it's certainly time to be taking the lessons of this war in Ukraine and applying them to ourselves.
Another night, I would love to have a conversation with you, Admiral, about this more, about the shifting nature of war, how you can have a few citizen soldiers who are trained for a few days on firing a shoulder-mounted Javelin missile that can go up and poke a tank right in the top and just boom, and take it right off the battlefield. But that is a conversation for another night. But I do take your point in terms of the changing nature of warfare. Admiral James Stavridis, always good to see you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joshua.
And remember, we always welcome your questions about the war in Ukraine. We are at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. You can reach us directly by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Millions of Ukrainians fled their homes, many by train. Still to come, you'll meet some of the conductors and attendants who carry them to safety. Plus, America's trains, planes, and ride service apps no longer require masks. Should you choose to wear one anyway? We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Railways are one of Ukraine's lifelines in this war, helping millions of people escape. The trains keep running despite a recent attack on a station in the east. What is it like for the attendants who keep things moving and for the passengers who so desperately need a ride? Some of them shared their stories with NBC Global correspondent Raf Sanchez.
On platform 2 of Ternopil station, a hug that feels like it may never end. Valentina and Irina, childhood friends from Kyiv, running into each other by chance amid the chaos of war.
I'm not alone anymore. I'm not alone in this difficult journey.
Valentina had raced home to see her terminally ill father, but she didn't make it in time. So you were trying to get to your dying father in the middle of a war.
Yeah.
How important was the train for you?
They are heroes. Just to take care of all these passengers, take care of all Ukrainians, and just support and give these trains.
Ukraine's railways, nearly 14,000 miles of steel and iron, and a vital lifeline for this country through these last 2 months of fighting. This is a westbound train going from Kyiv to Lviv, and every day, rain, shine, Russian bombs, trains like this have been running across Ukraine, ferrying people to safety and moving humanitarian aid to where it's needed most. Every day, thousands of people fleeing the war-torn east, the trains, the only way to move so many so quickly. Among them, Oksana, fleeing with her dog from the besieged city of Mariupol. It was very scary because Mariupol is a very peaceful city, she says. There was a lot of shelling. My friend died. A lot of people died. At the head of Ukraine's national railway company, 37-year-old Alexander Commission. What is it like to be running a railway during wartime?
I don't know. I haven't had any moment to think about it.
Crisscrossing the country, keeping the trains moving, and following his president's orders. What have President Zelensky's instructions been to you about the railway during the war?
His instruction is quite simple. He says, keep running the company, keep doing your job.
A quarter of Ukraine's railway has been damaged by Russian bombs, but nowhere hit like Kramatorsk station in the east. 59 people killed, including 7 children, when rockets slammed into the crowd trying to flee west. Ukrainian officials say they'll send this bloody toy to the UN as proof of war crimes. Railway staff have suffered enormous losses of their own.
95 killed, 103 injured, and 4 kept as a hostage by Russians.
Among them, Natalia Babacheva, an attendant killed in the Donbass in March. Her daughter writing, "You'll always be there in my heart, Mom, my angel, my hero, rest in peace." We met driver Andrei Bobrovsky on the last leg of his journey into Lviv and wanted to ask about a very special nickname. They call the rail workers the Iron People. Tell me about that.
We are working, doing our duties that we are charged to do. People rely on us, citizens who are running away from war.
Are you scared when you get on the train that today might be the day the Russians bomb a train?
Anything can happen. You can expect anything from them. I have fear, but I have to do my duty.
He has only a few moments to talk, more journeys to make, more people to move. Back on the 302 from Ternopil, 1-year-old Leoyea is enjoying her first ever train journey. She doesn't know it's the start of her family's new life as refugees. Do you think one day you'll come back to Ukraine, that she'll grow up here? Of course, he says, there's a Ukrainian proverb, everywhere is good, but home is best. And when it's finally safe enough for Leoyea to come home, you can bet it'll be a train that takes her there. Raf Sanchez, NBC News, Ternopil, Ukraine.
Up next, masks are no longer required for air travelers in the U.S. Some passengers are probably thrilled about that. But how do airline workers feel about the change? The head of the Flight Attendants Union joins us just ahead. Stay close. So it seems that the Biden administration may fight to save its mask mandate on mass transportation. Yesterday, you may remember a federal judge ruled that the CDC's mandate on planes, trains, and buses had to go. Well, now the Department of Justice says that if the CDC decides it considers this mandate necessary, then it will appeal that ruling. Today, the president responded publicly to the case.
Mr. President, should people continue to wear masks on planes?
That's up to them.
Are you going to like to appeal the ruling or the ruling that the judge made striking down the mandate?
I haven't spoken to the CDC yet. So thank you.
Now, even if the administration does appeal, the Justice Department says it would not seek an emergency stay of the judge's order. That spares us from having the mandates go up and down and in effect and out of effect during the court process. And the CDC still, to be clear, recommends masks on indoor public transportation. But also to be clear, this ruling did not abolish mask requirements completely. Some places still do require them. Today, Uber and Lyft dropped their face covering requirements for drivers and passengers. Transit authorities in New Jersey followed suit, but New York is indeed still requiring masks on transit and at the airports. In Chicago, the CTA transit line is encouraging masks. In California, masks on transit are optional, but strongly encouraged. We have heard from several of you about these changes. Silver tweeted, "People have already been ignoring the mask mandates for months, so this won't change anything. Personally, I'll continue masking and spacing out my in-person social interactions as much as possible to limit spread. Our most vulnerable need us to be responsible." And Holly tweeted, "I'm flying in a couple weeks and I'll still wear my COVID corsage just in case the people around me are compromised and request it." Joining us now is Sarah Nelson, who represents some of the world's most frequent flyers as the union president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA. Ms. Nelson, welcome. Good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
I'd love to get your reactions not only to the ruling, but your reactions to the reactions. This decision got announced mid-flight on some planes. Check out what happened on one flight when the announcement was made by the pilot.
Transportation Security Administration will no longer enforce the federal mandate requiring masks in all U.S. airports and on-board aircraft.
What do you make of that?
Well, look, there's a lot of people in transportation who are happy that they no longer have to enforce this and they no longer have to wear it themselves. But we also have many who have been relying on this to keep themselves and their families safe. We really had a mixed bag there. What I really don't like to see about that video is that that was a message coming from the airline management deciding to change the policy mid-flight. So some people bought those tickets, made decisions to come on that plane with the understanding that the rules were a certain set of rules, that everyone had to wear those masks, and that may have been part of their decision-making process. We got messages from all over the system saying exactly that, that we had families now who were very concerned, who had kids under the age of 5 who had not been able to be vaccinated. We had people who had decided to make a trip to see their family or to go for a medical treatment. They're immunocompromised, and it was a serious risk for them to go, and they took some comfort in the fact that the mask mandate was there. So to change this for people in a moment's notice without giving people the ability to opt out, once you're in that metal tube in the air, you can't do that. That really put the people on the front lines, once again, it has been the workers on the front lines who have had to pick up the pieces here just because of that judge's ruling. That did not mean that these companies needed to change on a dime. What we said was take 24, 48 hours to get the policy out, make sure everyone is aware of what the new policies are, what the rules are, what's recommended, your best way to protect you if you're not doing that. Otherwise, this creates confusion, conflict, distrust, and then that goes on the frontline workers who have to pick up the pieces. And that's just not good for any of us.
Right, right. And I do want to note again that the largest of the major airlines have announced that they're making their mask mandates optional, but there are some that still say that those are in place. Greyhound says it's continuing to, in its words, follow the federal guidelines and recommending face masks. Some airports, including Philadelphia International Airport, are still asking for masks to be worn inside the terminals. But then some venues have changed the rules. We learned before we went on the air that the Walt Disney World Resort has decided to make masks optional for guests. So again, please check from place to place. This does not abolish these mandates coast to coast. Ms. Nelson, I wonder what you're hearing from flight attendants just about how life and work have been lately. I mean, we're coming off a big holiday weekend. TSA says about 2 million people a day pass through airports. We heard from a flight attendant named Kimberly who tweeted that she's going to continue to wear a mask. What are flight attendants telling you in terms of just what their lives have been like lately trying to enforce this rule?
Oh, it's been very difficult to enforce this rule. And let's be really clear, while this has been in place, people have had to check a box even before the federal mask mandate was in place, because we worked with airlines 2 years ago to put these mask policies in place even before the federal government did. This was a part of gaining confidence in the ability to travel by air. This was not just a threat to our safety and health over the past 2 years, but this was a major economic threat to us as well. And so that confidence in air travel and that safety, being able to take that safety for granted, is very important in order to maintain that trust in air travel. And that has to be there in order for people to buy tickets. So we're hearing from flight attendants who all across the board who recognize that this has been a really frustrating thing to deal with when grown people check a box and say they're going to do this at the point of sale, at the point of check-in, again, all the way through the airport when they're asked that and they're reminded that, and then they get on the plane, and then it's been a conflict, and it's been a constant effort to try to remind people. Mind you, this is from people who have been on the front line since the beginning of the pandemic. They believe in getting vaccinated, they believe in wearing the masks, all of these things, but they themselves have had to wear these masks for 14, 15, 16-hour days. And I'll tell you what, as we're coming into some more summer months, that is especially when that gets really uncomfortable. So this has been very hard on the people on the front lines who've had to wear the mask themselves, enforce that. Yeah. But it's also been disorienting because we usually get our instructions from public health officials. We carry out those instructions. And it's not this question of what is the public opinion, or is this political? Is this a political debate? And that has been what has been so difficult all this time, created conflict on our planes and made this and really extended the pandemic as well.
One last thing briefly before I got to let you go. Air travel's been quite challenged by COVID. We've heard lately about the lack of pilots at a number of airlines, including Alaska Airlines, that had to cancel a whole bunch of flights because it just didn't have enough pilots to fly the planes. How are you seeing the future of being a flight attendant these days in terms of just having enough people to do the job, enough people coming in, especially with all of these changes in the environment to what it's like to be on a plane? What's the workforce look like going forward? I mean, is now a good time to apply to become a flight attendant these days?
Well, we're gonna go into contract negotiations and hopefully make it better very soon. But let me just say that people have not picked up as many trips. People are not applying at the same rate as they were before because of all that conflict when people go to work. So the overtime hours are not there. What we saw also over the winter holidays was we saw staffing shortages. That was because the spike in the pandemic. And one of the reasons that the CDC had extended the mask mandate by 2 weeks was to help us get through this expected surge. Part of that is keeping our economy going and making sure that people are not getting sick and able to come to work. So the pandemic also exacerbates the staffing shortages, because when people are out sick at a higher rate, then you have fewer people to pick up the pieces of that operation. So I'm really concerned about what we're going to see over the next month and over the summer, depending upon how the pandemic ebbs and flows, but also as you're saying, in these conditions where conflict has abounded, where it has been harder with more people, less staff, a much harder job, and not able to pick up those overtime hours, it's going to make it harder for everyone on the front lines, and that is going to make it harder to attract people to the job as well.
And let's just be clear for everybody watching, the mask mandate may now be optional. Obeying the orders of flight attendants is not, and you can still get in trouble with the air marshal if you post up on a flight attendant or give them a hard time or get physical with them. They're just the messengers following federal regulations. So this has not changed the rules in terms of how you deal with flight attendants, masks or not. Sarah Nelson is president of the
Association. Thank you so much.
And I appreciate it. I got to fly tomorrow, and I cannot wear to put on my COVID corsage because that guy's coughing over there. That one didn't bathe. I don't know these people. I'm wearing my mask on tomorrow's flight. Sarah Nelson is the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA. Ms. Nelson, good to see you. Thank you very much.
Good to see you, too. Thank you.
We will get to some of today's other top stories in a moment, including an update on that fatal police shooting in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Plus, we're learning more about an amusement park ride in Orlando where a teenager fell to his death. And a legal effort could ban Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene from seeking a second term. We are learning more about a fatal police-involved shooting in Michigan. It has been 2 weeks since the death of Patrick Leoyea. What began as a traffic stop in Grand Rapids turned into a struggle with an as-yet unnamed officer. Today, an independent autopsy confirmed that the 26-year-old was shot in the back of the head. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump says he will investigate whether racial profiling was a factor.
We have to investigate thoroughly whether this is a DWB. Where we know in the African American community as the classic driving while black profiling case. You literally see an officer going in the opposite direction of a black motorist, look over, identify there's a black motorist in the car, and then make a U-turn and get behind the motorist.
NBC's Shaquille Brewster has more on the forensic pathology expert who conducted the autopsy.
There is no question what killed 26-year-old Patrick Leoyea. That was the message that we heard from the forensic pathologist hired by his family attorney to do an independent private autopsy of his body. We heard this in a press conference earlier this afternoon, or earlier today, by attorney Benjamin Crump, who was giving this press conference in Detroit, Michigan. And he said that the autopsy made clear that Patrick Leoyea was shot in the back of his head by a single shot by the officer after that April 4th traffic stop. This again was a private investigation that was being done by the family attorney. The official medical examiner report still is going to remain private until the conclusion of the Michigan State Police investigation. That official report is not going to come out for some time. But I want you to listen to a little bit of what we heard from the medical examiner and the family attorney at that presser earlier today.
You can see the probe going into the back of the head and out in the right side, up a little higher than the entrance wound. And at that point, there is another hole that I made because the bullet went through the bone and lodged under the skin.
Dr. Warner Spitz is actually connected to many high-profile investigations, including the investigations into the assassination of JFK and MLK, and even the case against Casey Anthony more recently. Now, the family was not present at that press conference earlier today. You can only imagine what it would be like for them to hear those graphic details, but we do know that Patrick Leoyea will be laid to rest at a funeral service on Friday. Back to you.
Thank you, Shaq. That's NBC's Shaquille Brewster with the latest. In Florida, the investigation continues after a teenager fell to his death from an amusement park ride. Last month, 14-year-old Tyree Sampson fell from this drop tower at Icon Park in Orlando. The tower is a new ride. It's 430 feet high. Today, the state announced that a forensic engineer has finalized a field investigation report. They concluded that someone adjusted the boy's seat on the ride, making it unsafe.
The report confirmed that manual adjustments had been made to the sensor for the seat in question that allowed the harness to restraint opening to be almost double that of the normal restraint opening range. These misadjustments allow the safety lights to illuminate, improperly satisfying the ride's electronic safety mechanisms that allowed the ride to operate, even though Mr. Sampson was not properly secured in the seat.
The drop tower will remain closed indefinitely as the investigation continues. Penalties and revised regulations will be considered later. We're awaiting comment from Orlando Eagle Drop Slingshot LLC. That's the company that owns the free fall ride. President Biden's infrastructure plan was the talk of Washington until Russia invaded Ukraine. And now the White House is trying to bring it back to the forefront. Mr. Biden is hitting the road this week. The goal is to remind voters of the infrastructure law that passed back in November. He is also making a case for the Democratic Party's accomplishments so far. This push comes ahead of the upcoming midterms, which are now just under 7 months away. The president will visit 3 cities on this trip. He started off in Portsmouth, New Hampshire today. Then on Thursday, he goes to Portland, Oregon, and on Friday, he's up in Seattle. NBC White House correspondent Mike Memoli has more from Portsmouth. Hey, Mike.
Joshua, this week we're seeing President Biden do something he hasn't done yet during his term in office. He's got 3 different events on the schedule across the country talking about his domestic political agenda. This is the kind of travel we haven't seen as a combination of COVID, but also the fact that he's really been tied down in Washington dealing with the situation in Ukraine. But the White House feels the urgency to get him back out there because as we get into the midterm election, Democrats know his approval rating is going to be a key determinant in just whether they're able to keep control in Congress. And so what we saw here today in New Hampshire was a real template for what the White House can hope to see moving forward, which is the president praising both Senator Maggie Hassan, who is facing a difficult challenge in her bid for a second term, as well as Congressman Chris Pappas, who represents one of the swingiest districts in the country, who were integral in their work on the bipartisan infrastructure law. They're talking about $17 billion that's going to go to ports like the one here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to help deal with some of those supply chain challenges. We heard President Biden throughout his remarks here talking about Maggie, Chris, and I and the work they're doing to try to deal with these issues that are facing ordinary Americans. Interestingly, though, he talked about the fact that gas prices, he knows, is a very real challenge for American people. He said some of the work that he's done, including the release of petroleum from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has brought down oil prices 18 cents, as he said here today, but that because of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and, of course, calling it Putin's price hike, we're going to see those challenges continue for some time. But he said he's optimistic about the course of this country's future if they can continue to get more done to build the economy, as he put it, from the bottom up and the middle out. Now, today, as I said, this is just the start. Later this week, he's going to be traveling to Portland, Oregon, again talking about infrastructure. Friday, going on to Seattle, Washington, talking about his environmental agenda, and Earth Day, talking about the work that he still intends to do at a time when, yes, he has broken a campaign promise, as his administration announced. Under a court order, it will expand and resume the leasing of federal lands for the purposes of oil and gas drilling. Joshua, the president also doing some fundraising. We know a big part of the midterm equation is whether Democrats are going to have the resources to compete, and he's determined to do his part to make that happen. Joshua?
Thank you, Mike. That's NBC's Mike Memoli reporting from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. You know, it's one thing to beat a lawmaker at the polls, but one Republican congresswoman faces a lawsuit that could ban her from running again, and it has to do with the January 6th insurrection. A federal judge has ruled that a challenge to Marjorie Taylor Greene's re-election bid can proceed. The lawsuit accuses the Georgia congresswoman of helping obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. It alleges that her actions disqualify her from serving in Congress. Congresswoman Greene is denying that she played a role in the insurrection. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard joins us to explain in a moment, but first, here's his report.
Now they're coming after me to remove my name off the ballot.
On Friday, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican congresswoman from Georgia, is set to face questions under oath about her involvement in the January 6th insurrection. That hearing could potentially lead the court to prevent her from running for re-election.
We aren't going to let this election be stolen by Joe Biden and the Democrats. This is our 1776 moment.
Greene has consistently promoted the lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen and found an ally in former President Trump along the way.
We're going to send our favorite president right back where he belongs, in the White House.
But a group of Georgia voters, represented by a legal advocacy group, filed a challenge to her candidacy, citing a section of the 14th Amendment that says no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies. The group's legal director.
The evidence shows that Marjorie Taylor Greene, in the days leading up to January 6th, played a significant role in facilitating the events of that day.
Greene tried to stop the challenge, but a federal judge on Monday, in a 73-page report, cleared the way for the case to be heard this Friday. Greene, subpoenaed to testify, will face questions under oath about the extent of her involvement.
But what does that mean, participation in an insurrection? There's not a lot of case law in that area.
The levers of power in Washington, D.C. are controlled by dark forces.
Just last month, a federal judge in North Carolina blocked a similar effort to remove Madison Cawthorn, another Republican member of Congress, from the ballot this year.
The federal judge in Georgia who's being asked to decide whether this Georgia proceeding can go forward wasn't very compelled by the decision in the Cawthorn case.
Greene's office and her lawyer have not responded to NBC News for comment, but she has denied involvement in the violence on January 6th. And late Tuesday, Greene appealed the judge's ruling to the 11th Circuit.
Who will ultimately make this case, whether Marjorie Taylor Greene is on the ballot?
That administrative law judge won't have the final word. Either party can appeal a final order into the Georgia state courts. And so there could be a proceeding going all the way up to the Georgia Supreme Court, which one suspects will have the final say.
Vaughn Hilliard joins us now. And Vaughn, I want to be clear for the people who are watching us from other countries and kind of beginning to get an inlet into how U.S. elections work at this level. No one, as I understand it, is accusing Marjorie Taylor Greene of committing any acts of violence on January 6th, right? This has more to do with her political rhetoric before and after the insurrection, her opposition of the certification of the election. It's more about her rhetoric than her physical actions, right?
Right, that is accurate. This is not necessarily violence that anybody is aware that Marjorie Taylor Greene partook in on January 6th, but it's the entire lead up to this here. And this hits at the heart of the question, what does it mean to, quote, be engaging in insurrection or rebellion here? And that is where you heard from Joyce Vance there. The case law is not very deep on this front here. We haven't seen in the United States this sort of an action against the U.S. federal government since, the Civil War here. And that is why so much of this case law that we talk about is actually hearkening back to the Civil War when when the 14th Amendment, Section 3 here, was ratified to include this in order to keep Confederate soldiers and Confederate leaders from serving in the federal government in the United States here. And that is where this is going to be put to the test here in these days ahead.
Yeah, I want to be clear, and for those of you who, like me, are not constitutional scholars, this is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that basically says if you have taken any oath to the Constitution of the United States and you hold any state or federal office and you've engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the nation, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, you are disqualified. But it also adds, Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. So you could be disqualified unless 2/3 of Congress says it's okay for you to serve anyway. Vaughn, this sounds like it's on completely uncharted legal ground. What's the good money on whether or not this case will even move forward, or whether everyone will go, we're good, we're just not going to answer this question?
Right. So we got that 73-page report from a federal judge there in Georgia just yesterday, which essentially said it is going to be up to the state of Georgia, their courts, and their Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who you have talked to just recently and is a Republican, but is not necessarily a sympathetic figure to individuals like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who essentially have perpetuated and propagated this idea that the 2020 election was stolen. But that is where just late here this afternoon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, understanding the dynamics at the state level, appealed that federal judge's ruling to the 11th Circuit Appeals Court, hoping that they come in and essentially say this is not up to the state to make this ruling. Much like in the way we saw Madison Cawthorn just last month in North Carolina, another Republican member of Congress who faced a similar type of effort to remove him from the ballot. And it was actually the judge, the federal judge in that case, which is what Marjorie Taylor Greene is hoping for from this appeals court, found that an 1872 act by Congress ultimately undid essentially Section 3 of the 14th Amendment by allowing those Confederate soldiers and leaders to run for office again here. And that is where Madison Cawthorn argued that that piece of federal legislation applied to him, yes, 150 years later. That federal judge agreed. The one that is so far ruled in the Marjorie Taylor Greene case disagree. That's why we're going to be looking here so much at what this appeals court now says in all of this. We're learning together, Joshua.
We are indeed learning our Constitution line by line. Thank you, Vaughn. That's NBC's Vaughn Hilliard with a genuinely fascinating constitutional story. More women are breaking barriers in baseball. We will introduce you to some of the Major League's newest trailblazers before we go. All right, before we go, we want to hear your stories for an upcoming report about legalized cannabis. On Thursday, New Jersey will open its first recreational marijuana shops. People 21 and over will be able to purchase cannabis products without a medical card. 17 other states and Washington, D.C. have all legalized pot for adult use. New Jersey regulators are promising to prioritize vendors who have prior pot convictions to counteract past crackdowns. Tomorrow, we'll introduce you to someone who's applying for one of the first social equity licenses in New Jersey. We'll also take you inside a cannabis cultivation facility as they prepare for the first legal sales in the Garden State. If these kinds of social equity efforts resonate with you, tell us your story. How has the push for cannabis legalization affected you? We are at NBC Now Tonight on social media. Remember, you can leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC, or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Look around Major League Baseball these days, and you'll find more women in roles that men have typically dominated. Coaches, scouts, even executives, and that seems to be by design. Here's NBC's Katie Beck.
Thank you. For girls who love baseball, the field of their dreams is opening up.
Don't let people tell you what you can't do.
More females finding the sky their new limit.
I can't hear you.
Who better to advise the next generation than Miami Marlins general manager Kim Ng, the first female GM of a major league team.
By you doing what you guys do, which is playing baseball, when a lot of people are telling you shouldn't or you can't, you're examples for others.
This month, Major League Baseball organizing an event for girls who play the game called the Trailblazers Series.
I want to play in the Major League MLB, but I don't really care if I'm the first or even the last. I just want to play.
While women still make up only a small fraction of front office and coaching staffs, there are promising signs of progress. Last week, the Giants' Alyssa Nakken became the first woman to coach on field in a major league game. Kelsey Whitmore signed with an Atlantic League team as a player. And manager Rachel Balkovitz on a winning streak with her minor league Tampa Tarpons. She's the first woman to hold the job.
There's definitely the outlier.
I spoke with her back in 2020 after she became the Yankees' first female minor league hitting coach.
My end goal really is to impact and empower as many people as possible.
Women stepping up to the plate, promoting a more inclusive playing field.
That's NBC's Katie Beck reporting. And another remarkable woman will be in the chair for me tomorrow. Morgan Radford is filling in then. I am back on Thursday, but until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Thanks for making time for us. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.